A 8-foot giant challenged Steven Seagal, mocking his age and claiming he would crush him in seconds. But what seemed like a massacre turned into an epic lesson. With calm, precision, and unwavering mastery, Seagal took down the Colossus time and time again, proving that true strength lies not in muscles, but in spirit. A battle no one will ever forget. If you don't want to miss our content, hit the like button and subscribe below. Also, turn on notifications and tell us where you're watching from. We appreciate your support. Today you will witness a clash of power and wisdom. Who will prevail? Comment where you're watching from, like and subscribe. The most exciting part is yet to come. The lights of the MGM Grand Arena blazed like a crown of fire over Las Vegas. And inside the octagon, the crowd roared as if the walls themselves were shaking. The night had already delivered knockouts, blood, and shattered pride. But everyone knew they were waiting for one man. Hayan, the giant Cole, the undefeated Colossus, who stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, had just demolished another opponent in a display of pure, brute force. His arms rose like pillars, his chest glinting under the spotlights. He circled the cage as the referee checked on the man he'd left unconscious on the canvas. Hayan thrived on this. The adrenaline, the roar of the crowd, the fear in the eyes of anyone who stood before him. He was a showman as much as he was a man of violence. And tonight he wanted more than just another win on his record. He wanted immortality. The announcer was still shouting his name when Hayan snatched the microphone from his hand. The crowd fell silent for a moment, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. Panting, but grinning like a predator, Hayan leaned toward the microphone. "Look at this," he roared, pointing at his opponent's motionless body. "This is what happens when giants enter the cage. Nobody can touch me, not these so-called contenders, not these washed-up legends. I am the fight game now. And if you want proof, bring me the biggest name you can get out of retirement. Hell, bring me Steven Seagal. Yes, you heard me right. Let's see if the movie star wants to step in here with a real fighter." The audience erupted, half in laughter, half in disbelief. The idea was absurd, even offensive. Steven Seagal was a man who carried weight not because of the octagon, but because of the decades he had dedicated as a martial artist, Aikido master, and trainer of soldiers and special forces. In the movies, he moved with serene grace, but his reputation in real life was far more dangerous than any choreographed stunt. To mock him was to mock a legacy. Hayan knew it and wanted it. The controversy, the storm, the headlines that would spread faster than any replay of his last knockout. And then the cameras panned. In the VIP balcony, illuminated by the glow of the giant screens, sat Steven Seagal. He wore a dark suit, his arms crossed, his face a mask of composure. He gazed into the octagon with eyes that betrayed nothing, no anger, no amusement, no acknowledgement of the insult hurled at him, only stillness, like a mountain watching a storm pass. That silence was louder than any counterattack. The energy in the arena shifted as thousands of spectators realized the challenge hadn't been thrown into the void. It had been heard. Hayan's smile widened as he saw the cameras focused on Seagal. He pointed at him with exaggerated bravado. "There he is. You think you're still a warrior? Come in here and prove it. Or admit to the world you're just another relic hiding behind your old stories." The crowd booed and cheered in equal measure, torn between outrage and entertainment. Social media exploded immediately. Within minutes, videos of Hayan's challenge went viral worldwide. Memes flooded the internet. Some mocked the giant fighter's arrogance. Others fantasized about an impossible showdown between the Colossus and the calm, aging Aikido master. Back in the cage, Hayan threw the microphone to the ground, beating his chest like a gladiator who had conquered Rome. He was bathed in noise, every camera pointed at him. every commentator trying to interpret what had just happened. The referee tried to remove him from the octagon, but Hayen brushed him aside, continuing his spectacle, feeding off the chaos he had unleashed. On the balcony, Seagal rose slowly, not with the ostentation of a showman, but with the quiet inevitability of a tide receding from the shore. He didn't speak to the reporters, didn't acknowledge the chants of his name, simply turned away from the glass railing, his broad shoulders disappearing into the corridor. That single act, that refusal to participate, became the defining moment of the night. Silence versus spectacle, stillness versus noise, the master versus the giant. When Hayen finally emerged from the octagon, surrounded by his entourage, reporters swarmed him, seeking statements. The river of voices in their microphones repeated his challenge, goading Seagal into facing him under the lights. "He's got nothing left," Hayen declared. "I'll cut him in half like all the others. Let's give the crowd what they want." And what the people wanted was fire, and Hayen had delivered. But somewhere beyond the lights, in the shadows of the arena's concourses, Steven Seagal walked with the same quiet certainty that had accompanied him through decades of discipline. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to prove himself to believe in who he was. However, the gauntlet had been thrown down at his feet. And though he said nothing, the world already believed an answer had been given. The night ended in chaos. Fans overflowing the streets of Las Vegas, arguing about what they had witnessed. Was it a publicity stunt? Had the disrespect gone too far? Would Seagal respond or ignore the arrogance of a man who knew nothing of balance, patience, or control? For Hayen, the seeds of his greatest spectacle had been sown. For Seagal, a storm he hadn't summoned was already brewing. And so the stage was set. A titan drunk on his own power against a master who had nothing left to prove. Two worlds colliding, not by destiny, but by pride. The fight world had a new story to tell, and it began with a single taunt thrown under the blazing lights of Las Vegas. The repercussions of the challenge spread like wildfire. For days afterward, sports news programs, late-night talk shows, and even international headlines were all about it. The giant Hayen Cole had dared to publicly challenge Steven Seagal. Some dismissed it as a ridiculous joke, a marketing ploy designed to grab headlines. Others saw it as an insult that shouldn't go unanswered. In every martial arts gym, from Los Angeles to Tokyo, the same question was being discussed. What if, against all logic, Gal accepted? Internet forums buzzed with theories. Edited videos showed Hayen overwhelming his opponents, juxtaposed with scenes of Seagal dropping men with the slightest flick of his wrist. It was muscle versus technique, youth versus age, brute power versus refined composure. People were taking sides. Some scoffed at the idea that an actor, regardless of his legacy, could survive a cage fight with a professional giant. Others countered that Seagal wasn't just an actor, that he had trained champions, police officers, and elite soldiers, that his art didn't rely on strength, but on a deeper understanding of balance. In the midst of the media storm, Hayen seized every second of attention. "I've said it before, and I'll say it again," he'd shout in interviews. "Steven Seagal is too old, too slow. He can't be on my level. This isn't a movie set. There are no stunt doubles here who go down at the first touch. Here, you bleed, you break, you prove who you really are. And I want to show the world that legends can fall too." His arrogance fueled even more headlines. They showed him punching heavy bags until they burst, lifting monstrous weights, training with an army of sparring partners who could barely last a round with him. Every move he made was designed to reinforce the narrative of the unstoppable predator. Meanwhile, Seagal remained silent. He gave no interviews. He didn't release any statements. He was only seen in brief, surreptitious camera shots, entering his dojo in Arizona, walking alongside students, or practicing circular movements that seemed too slow to mean anything. That silence began to transform into an aura of mystery. The question was no longer just whether he would accept, but what he was thinking. Fight promoters, smelling gold in the air, began to make their moves. They offered astronomical sums for a matchup that technically could never be tested under the official regulations of mixed martial arts. But money and spectacle could bend rules. And what was at stake wasn't just a fight. It was a clash of cultures, a duel between eras, an event that promised to be bigger than any championship. The betting started even before there was a contract. "Seagal doesn't stand a chance," they wrote in the forums. "Hyen will crush him in the first minute." Others responded fervently. Never underestimate experience. A single well-executed move can change everything. Hyen's trainers pushed him harder than ever, convinced that the fight was just a matter of time. He himself kept fanning the flames. "I'll force him out of the shadows," he growled in front of the cameras. "I'm going to show that age doesn't forgive, that wisdom doesn't stop a punch, that calmness is useless when a giant slams you to the ground." His campaign of provocation reached a new level when he appeared on a live television program sitting before an expectant audience. "Look at me," he said, spreading his arms wide as if embracing the entire stage. "I'm at the peak of my power, 2.5, 150 kg muscle. And on the other side, what do we have? A man who's past his prime, who prefers to hide in his dojo rather than face the world, who's afraid of losing his aura. Well, I'm going to rip it off in front of everyone." The crowd applauded, some out of conviction, others simply for the spectacle of seeing him challenge such an untouchable figure. And yet, the other half of the audience anxiously awaited Seagal's response. The response, when it came, wasn't a speech, an interview, or a statement. A journalist managed to approach Seagal as he was leaving a restaurant. Amid the throng of cameras and shouted questions, one of the reporters managed to catch his low, calm voice. "I'm not interested in empty fights," Seagal said. "But when a man insults not only me, but the spirit of the arts that I respect, sometimes the only response is to show him what he's never learned." Those few words were enough to set the entire planet ablaze. News networks broadcasted on repeat. Promoters practically melted with joy. The stakes doubled in a matter of hours. Now it was no longer just a challenge. It was real. Yen, upon hearing the news, roared with triumph. "I knew it," he exclaimed to his supporters. The old man fell into the trap. Now he had no way out, but in his eyes shone more than mere confidence. There was a spark of genuine excitement, a hunger that went beyond the spectacle. He wanted something no other opponent had given him, a war that could define him. For the first time in his career, it wasn't just about winning. It was about destroying a symbol. The negotiations were swift. The chosen venue, an open-air stadium in Dubai, where money and logistics could sustain anything. The event was billed as the Battle of the Ages. Giant posters depicted the Colossus Hyen facing the calm figure of Steven Seagal, dressed in black, his hands clasped as if he were about to meditate, not fight. The contrast said it all. Strength versus serenity, youth versus age, arrogance versus silence. The whole world bought tickets, streams, and bets. And in the weeks leading up to the fight, while Hyen sweated and roared in his training camp, Seagal simply taught his students as always, moving with the slowness of a man who had never forgotten that patience was his greatest weapon. The day was approaching. The giant was ready to crush, the master ready to teach. The night of the event arrived like an anticipated storm. Dubai glittered under the artificial lights, an oasis of steel and glass rising from the desert. The stadium, built especially for the occasion, resembled a modern coliseum capable of holding more than 60,000 eager souls. And that night, it was packed. Tickets had sold out weeks in advance. Celebrities, sheikhs, athletes, and politicians mingled in a sea of anticipation. Giant screens broadcast aerial images. Drones crisscrossed the illuminated city like a cosmic chessboard. The atmosphere wasn't that of a simple fight. It was that of a historic trial. The crowd roared like a single animal. When Jen Cole appeared on the catwalk, the giant moved with the confidence of a king ascending his throne. His almost colossal body gleamed under the spotlights. He advanced with a slow, deliberate gait, arms outstretched, both greeting and provoking the crowd. He wore black shorts with gold embroidery, as if he had been born for the stage. The anthem that accompanied him was pure thunder, drums and bass booming like cannons. Every step he took made the ground tremble. Upon entering the cage, he slammed his wrapped fists against the metal bars, shaking the entire structure. The crowd roared, some out of admiration, others out of morbid curiosity, waiting to witness the impossible. The Colossus destroying a man who embodied an entire philosophy. Then, the lights dimmed. An eerie silence filled the stadium, and then a soft melody began to play. It wasn't Hayen's roar. It was calm. It was wind. It was like the murmur of water over ancient stones. From the shadows of the catwalk emerged Steven Seagal, dressed in black in a simple kimono that contrasted sharply with his rival's ostentatious attire. He walked slowly, not glancing at the crowd, not raising his arms, not seeking attention. His hands remained clasped in front of him, as if he were entering a temple, not a cage. The spotlights followed him, but he seemed indifferent to the light. His steps were firm, balanced, each one imbued with a quiet gravity. The contrast was absolute. On one side, the noisy spectacle of the giant. On the other, the imperturbable serenity of the master. The crowd, which had been roaring seconds before, fell into an expectant, almost reverential silence. Even those who had mocked him couldn't help but feel something as they watched him advance with such calm. Seagal entered the cage and took his place in his corner. He bowed slightly, acknowledging the referee and his opponent. There was no smile, no challenge, only respect. Jen, on the other hand, laughed loudly, pounding his chest like a gorilla. "Look at him," he shouted, pointing at Seagal. "Too old, too slow. This will be quick." The referee called them to the center. The cameras captured every detail. The enormous height difference, Hayen's monstrous musculature against Seagal's heavier, but more composed frame. The referee spoke. "I want a clean fight. Respect the rules. Touch gloves if you want." Seagal extended his hand. Hayen looked at it and smiled contemptuously, refusing. The crowd booed, but the giant just raised his arms, feeding off the noise. The referee gave the signal. The bell rang. The first round began. Hayen came out like a bull in a china shop, charging forward with strides that shook the ground. He threw a devastating punch aimed straight at Seagal's face. A blow that, if it connected, could end the fight in seconds, but it missed. Seagal barely turned his head like a leaf deflected by the wind, and the fist grazed him. The giant grunted, surprised by the speed of the movement. He immediately threw another and another, a flurry of blows that would have demolished any ordinary defense. But Seagal didn't block, didn't respond with force. He just moved. A flick of the wrist, a sidestep, a minimal shift. The crowd watched at first in disbelief, then fascinated. The giant punched at the air. Seagal seemed to float, moving with the precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting every angle. Jen roared in frustration. "Fight for real!" he yelled, throwing a monstrous kick. Seagal stepped back, just enough for the leg to pass in front of him. And in that instant, with an almost imperceptible movement, he placed his hand on the giant's knee and guided it to the ground. The Colossus lost his balance. The crowd gasped as the 6'10" man fell to his knees, not from a blow, but from his own deflected force. Seagal didn't attack, didn't try to strike. He simply took a step back, waiting. The referee watched intently. The crowd roared, divided between euphoria and disbelief. Hyen rose furiously, his face red with rage. Old cheat. He spat and charged again. But the same thing happened. Every attack, every attempt to crush him, was deflected with minimal movement, as if Seagal were turning the giant's force against himself. The commentators couldn't believe it. "This doesn't look like a fight," one said. "It looks like a lesson." The clock ticked. The first round ended. The crowd rose from their seats, shouting. Some in support, others in frustration. No one had expected to see the Colossus unable to land a single clean punch. In his corner, Jen panted, sweat trickling down his forehead. In the other, Seagal sat calmly, breathing slowly, as if nothing had happened. The second round promised more, and the giant knew he couldn't afford another mistake. The roar of the crowd sounded like endless thunder. When the second round began, Hyen stormed out of his corner like a wounded beast, determined to prove the first round had been a fluke. His face was hardened with fury, his eyes blazing with shame at not having been able to land a blow on a man he considered too old. The giant advanced, unleashing brutal combinations, each punch like a hammer blow that rattled the air. The ground trembled beneath his weight. The cage seemed too small to contain him. But Seagal didn't change. He continued to move with that impossible calm, dodging with circular steps, deflecting attacks with the slightest pressure of his hands. He wasn't fighting with strength. He was fighting with Hyen's own energy, using it against him. The crowd watched in an eerie silence, as if they couldn't comprehend what was happening before their eyes. Some shouted that it was luck. Others were beginning to realize that this wasn't chance, but a discipline that depended not on muscles, but on years of experience. Hyen, frustrated, changed tactics. He faked a high punch and in the same motion launched a rising knee aimed at Seagal's torso. The impact was brutal. The knee connected with the master's chest, and for the first time in the entire fight, Seagal took a step back. The crowd erupted in cheers. The Colossus roared triumphantly, smelling blood, convinced he had found the crack in the old warrior's armor. "I've got him," he bellowed, moving forward to finish him off. He threw a devastating hook straight to Seagal's face. But there, in that instant, everything changed. Seagal didn't back down. He smoothly rotated his body, grabbed Hyen's arm, and in a fluid, almost invisible movement, redirected all the giant's force downward. In the blink of an eye, the 7'1" Colossus was on the ground, his back slammed against the canvas. The entire stadium froze. The fall wasn't the result of a hard blow or a violent takedown. It was the result of a simple deflection executed with surgical precision. Hyen rose immediately, screaming with rage, pounding the ground with his fists like a bull refusing to be tamed. The crowd was divided, some cheering for the giant, others applauding Seagal with a fervor that grew with each passing second. "This is impossible," the commentators exclaimed. "The master is controlling a monster with barely a movement." The referee allowed it to continue. Hayen charged again, now with more fury than ever. Each movement was wilder, more desperate, and each time Seagal responded with the same. Calm, control, fluidity. Time and again, the giant was brought down. Never violently, always with the same economy of effort, as if he were being pulled by an invisible current. By the second minute of the round, Hayen's breathing was a bestial gasp. Sweat covered his face. His power remained intact, but his energy drained each time his punches fell into the void. Seagal, on the other hand, breathed calmly, showing no signs of exhaustion. Then came the moment no one would ever forget. Hayen, desperate, threw a hammer blow at Seagal's head. The master intercepted it with a simple flick of his wrist. He grabbed the giant's wrist and, in a circular motion, bent it forward. The Colossus roared in pain, falling to his knees as his own arm became trapped in an unbreakable hold. The crowd erupted. The referee approached, ready to stop the fight, but Seagal didn't apply the final pressure. He released the giant and stepped back. The gesture was clear. He wasn't trying to destroy him, only to teach him. Hayen lay on the ground for a few seconds, panting, his eyes wide, unable to comprehend how a single movement had reduced him to such helplessness. The clock struck the end of the second round. The crowd was on its feet, shouting, applauding, some weeping with emotion. It wasn't an ordinary fight. It was something more. In his corner, Hayen slumped onto the bench, his fists clenched, his pride shattered. In the other, Seagal sat with his back straight, eyes closed, breathing calmly, as if meditating amidst the chaos. The commentators summed up what everyone felt. This isn't a fight. It's a living lesson. The third round was about to begin, and the giant, though still full of strength, was no longer the same. He had seen that brutality doesn't always triumph, that against true mastery, strength alone isn't enough. The crowd knew the best was yet to come. And when the bell rang again, everyone held their breath. The third round began with electric tension. The crowd was divided. Some shouted Hayen's name, the 2.5-meter Colossus, who looked like a monster from another era. Others, increasingly numerous, chanted Steven Seagal's name, the veteran who had proven that wisdom could overcome brute force. Hayen stormed out of his corner, roaring, his face a mask of fury. He had already lost 2 rounds in what for him was worse than defeat. Public humiliation. The giant charged with his full weight, trying to crush Seagal against the cage. The impact was so brutal that the metal bars rattled with a high-pitched screech. The crowd roared in astonishment. For the first time, Seagal seemed trapped, his back pressed against the steel. The Colossus began to unleash blow after blow, each one powerful enough to shatter bones. But there was the calm. Hayen raised his arms, deflecting, absorbing the impact with the technique of someone who understood that strength is not fought with force, but with direction. Every punch Hayen threw seemed to deactivate in midair, redirected into the void. "This is impossible," the commentators shouted. The giant had him cornered, but couldn't hurt him. Hayen's face was flushed, his veins bulging, his desperation growing with each passing second. In a final attempt, he grabbed Seagal by the neck with both hands, lifting him off the ground as if he wanted to strangle him in front of the entire crowd. The whole stadium held its breath. For a moment, it seemed the giant's immense power would end it all. But then, Seagal barely moved one of his hands, twisting Hayen's wrist with surgical precision. The Colossus screamed in pain, like a tree uprooted, and fell to his knees. The crowd erupted. The referee rushed to intervene, but instead of finishing him off, Seagal immediately released the hold and stepped back. That gesture changed everything. It wasn't just a fight, it was an almost spiritual act of teaching. Heian remained on his knees, breathing like a weary beast, his massive arms hanging limp, his gaze filled with confusion. Never in his entire life had he felt anything like this. Not fear of pain, but the weight of powerlessness. The crowd, which had initially cheered him like an invincible monster, began to change its chant. A wave of voices rose up, shouting in unison, "Seagal! Seagal! Seagal!" The commentators summed it up in a single sentence. What we are witnessing is not one man defeating another. It is a master defeating ego. The clock was still ticking in the third round. Heian, in a desperate act, staggered to his feet. Despite everything, his pride wouldn't allow him to surrender. He launched himself again, attempting one last attack. But this time the crowd knew what was coming. Seagal waited for him, feet firmly planted, without retreating. When the giant raised his fist to strike, the master spun, grabbed him by the waist, and in one fluid motion, slammed him to the canvas. The impact was so powerful that the ground shook like a war drum. The colossus lay face up, his arms outstretched, gasping, unable to rise immediately. The referee began the count. 1, 2, 3. The crowd was on its feet, cheering at the top of their lungs. Some couldn't believe that this titan could be brought down time and time again by a man many called too old. Heian tried to get up, but his legs barely responded. 4, 5, 6. The camera focused on Seagal's face. There was no arrogance or pride, only calm. His eyes reflected the serenity of someone who wasn't fighting for glory, but to prove a greater truth. Heian staggered to his feet at the count of 8. The referee asked if he wanted to continue. The giant nodded, roaring with what little energy he had left. The bell rang, marking the end of the third round. The entire stadium erupted in cheers, knowing that what they had just witnessed was historic. In his corner, Yan slumped onto the stool, his chest rising and falling like a war drum. His trainer shouted strategies to him, but his eyes showed something else. Doubt. In the opposite corner, Seagal sat with his back straight and his hands on his knees, breathing silently, as if everything happening was just another training session on his long life's journey. The commentators summed up what everyone was thinking. If this fight were only about physical power, the giant would have already won. But what we see here is that experience and composure can tame even the wildest force. The crowd chanted Steven Seagal's name louder and louder, hailing him as a hero in the middle of the arena. The tension was at its peak. The fourth round would decide whether Heian still had the strength to keep fighting, or if the master would prove once and for all that there is no age limit to greatness. The referee raised his hand. The bell was about to ring again, and everyone knew the best was yet to come. The bell rang, signaling the start of the fourth round. The entire stadium roared, the cameras focused on every detail, and millions of people around the world held their breath. No one wanted to miss a single moment of what was about to happen. Jen, the 2.5-meter giant, staggered out of his corner. His steps were still heavy like a bull's, but his gaze had changed. There was no longer just fury, but doubt, fear disguised as pride. Before him, Steven Seagal rose with the serenity of a warrior monk. He walked unhurriedly to the center of the cage, his eyes fixed on the colossus, his breathing calm, as if all the violence around him didn't affect him. The crowd chanted his name. Seagal, Seagal, Seagal. The referee gave the signal. The giant roared and charged with the last of his energy. His fists fell like hammers, his knees sought to crush. His attacks were the fury of a man who refused to accept defeat. But Seagal was beyond fury. With each blow, he gently deflected. With each charge, he turned. With each desperate attempt by the giant, the response was calm, precise, and in complete control. The crowd watched in awe. It wasn't a fight. It was a master teaching a lesson in motion. Then came the decisive moment. Jane unleashed his most powerful punch, a right hook that would have finished anyone. The air whistled as his fist sliced through the air toward Seagal's face. But the master stepped to the side, grabbed the giant's wrist, and in one fluid motion, threw him over his shoulder. The colossus flew as if he had lost all his weight, crashing to the canvas with a resounding crash that shook the entire stadium. The giant lay there, stunned, his eyes staring blankly into space. The referee began the count. 1, 2, 3. The crowd roared with excitement. Some jumped from their seats, others couldn't believe what they were seeing. 4, 5, 6. Hyen tried to get up, but his arms trembled. His body no longer responded. 7, 8. The colossus dropped to one knee, panting like an exhausted beast, but he could go no further. 9, 10. Out. The bell rang, and the entire stadium erupted in a historic roar. Steven Seagal had defeated the giant. The commentators screamed uncontrollably. Unbelievable. The impossible had just happened. A man over 60 years old had just defeated a 7'10" giant. Seagal didn't raise his arms in triumph. Instead, he bent down to the prone giant, helped him to his feet, and patted him on the shoulder. The gesture said it all. There was no hatred, no humiliation, only respect. The crowd understood and rose to their feet, applauding not only the victor, but the master who had demonstrated that true strength lies not in muscles, but in discipline, composure, and spirit. Hyen, tears of frustration welling in his eyes, raised Seagal's hand in acknowledgement. The crowd roared even louder. It was an epic finale that no one would ever forget. The commentators summed it up in a single sentence. Today we saw that time does not defeat greatness. Steven Seagal proved that age doesn't matter. True mastery never ages. The maestro left the cage to cheers, his figure erect like a living legend. And so the whole world witnessed how a man everyone called too old defeated the most fearsome giant, not with strength, but with wisdom, honor, and unwavering composure. That day, Steven Seagal didn't just win a fight. He became an eternal symbol. He grabbed the giant's wrist, and in one fluid motion, he threw him over his shoulder. The colossus flew as if he'd lost all his weight, crashing into the canvas with a thunderous thud that shook the entire stadium. The giant lay there, stunned, his eyes staring blankly into space. The referee began the count. 1, 2, 3. The crowd roared. Some jumped from their seats, others couldn't believe what they were seeing. 4, 5, 6. Hyen tried to get up, but his arms trembled, his body no longer responded. 7, 8. The colossus dropped to one knee, panting like an exhausted beast, but he couldn't go on. 9, 10. Out. The bell rang, and the entire stadium erupted in a historic roar. Steven Seagal had defeated the giant. The commentators screamed uncontrollably. Incredible. The impossible had just happened. A man over 60 years old had just defeated a 2.5-meter colossus. Seagal didn't raise his arms in triumph. Instead, he bent down to the fallen giant, helped him to his feet, and patted him on the shoulder. The gesture said it all. There was no hatred, no humiliation, only respect. The crowd understood and rose to their feet, applauding not just the victor, but the master who had shown that true strength lies not in muscles, but in discipline, composure, and spirit. Hyen, tears of frustration welling in his eyes, raised Seagal's hand in acknowledgement. The crowd roared even louder. It was an epic finish that no one would ever forget. The commentators summed it up in a single sentence. Today we have seen that time does not defeat greatness. Steven Seagal has proven that no matter your age, true mastery never grows old. The master left the cage to cheers, his figure erect like a living legend. And so the whole world witnessed how a man everyone called too old defeated the most fearsome giant, not with strength, but with wisdom, honor, and unwavering calm. That day, Steven Seagal didn't just win a fight, he became an eternal symbol. He grabbed the giant's wrist, and in one fluid motion, he threw him over his shoulder. The colossus flew as if he'd lost all his weight, crashing into the canvas with a thunderous thud that shook the entire stadium. The giant lay there, stunned, his eyes staring blankly into space. The referee began the count. 1, 2, 3. The crowd roared. Some jumped from their seats. Others couldn't believe what they were seeing. 4, 5, 6. Hyen tried to get up, but his arms trembled. His body no longer responded. 7, 8. The colossus dropped to one knee, panting like an exhausted beast, but he couldn't go on. 9, 10. Out. The bell rang, and the entire stadium erupted in a historic roar. Steven Seagal had defeated the giant. The commentators screamed uncontrollably. Incredible. The impossible had just happened. A man over 60 years old had just defeated a 2.5-meter colossus. Seagal didn't raise his arms in triumph. Instead, he bent down to the fallen giant, helped him to his feet, and patted him on the shoulder. The gesture said it all. There was no hatred, no humiliation, only respect. The crowd understood and rose to their feet, applauding not just the victor, but the master who had shown that true strength lies not in muscles, but in discipline, composure, and spirit. Hyen, tears of frustration welling in his eyes, raised Seagal's hand in acknowledgement. The crowd roared even louder. It was an epic finish that no one would ever forget. The commentators summed it up in a single sentence. Today we have seen that time does not defeat greatness. Steven Seagal has proven that no matter your age, true mastery never grows old. The master left the cage to cheers, his figure erect like a living legend. And so the whole world witnessed how a man everyone called too old defeated the most fearsome giant, not with strength, but with wisdom, honor, and unwavering calm. That day, Steven Seagal didn't just win a fight. He became an eternal symbol. A man in his 60s had just defeated a 2.5-meter colossus. Seagal didn't raise his arms in triumph. Instead, he bent down to the prone giant, helped him to his feet, and patted him on the shoulder. The gesture said it all. There was no hatred, no humiliation, only respect. The crowd understood and rose to their feet, applauding not only the victor, but the master who had demonstrated that true strength lies not in muscles, but in discipline, composure, and spirit. Hyen, tears of frustration welling in his eyes, raised Seagal's hand in acknowledgement. The crowd roared even louder. It was an epic finish that no one would ever forget. The commentators summed it up in a single sentence. Today we have seen that time does not defeat greatness. Steven Seagal has proven that no matter your age, true mastery never grows old. The master left the cage to cheers, his figure erect like a living legend. And so the whole world witnessed how a man everyone called too old defeated the most fearsome giant, not with strength, but with wisdom, honor, and unwavering calm. That day, Steven Seagal didn't just win a fight. He became an eternal symbol. A man in his 60s had just defeated a 2.5-meter colossus. Seagal didn't raise his arms in triumph. Instead, he bent down to the prone giant, helped him to his feet, and patted him on the shoulder. The gesture said it all. There was no hatred, no humiliation, only respect. The crowd understood and rose to their feet, applauding not only the victor, but the master who had demonstrated that true strength lies not in muscles, but in discipline, composure, and spirit. Hayan, tears of frustration welling in his eyes, raised Seagal's hand in acknowledgement. The crowd roared even louder. It was an epic finish that no one would ever forget. The commentators summed it up in a single sentence. Today we have seen that time does not defeat greatness. Steven Seagal has proven that no matter your age, true mastery never grows old. The master left the cage to cheers, his figure erect like a living legend. And so the whole world witnessed how a man everyone called too old defeated the most fearsome giant, not with strength, but with wisdom, honor, and unwavering calm. That day, Steven Seagal didn't just win a fight. He became an eternal symbol.